This is the Mobile Tech Podcast, brought to you by worldpodcasts.com. Now here's your host, Tech Girl, Miriam Joie.
Brought to you by Audible. Stay tuned for a special offer at the end of the show. Hi, and welcome to the Mobile Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Joie, and today is Thursday, July 2nd, 2020, the day after Canada Day. And speaking of, I have the very Canadian Rene Ritchie here on the show today. Hi, Rene. How are you?
Salut, Miriam.
Salut. Ça va?
Ça va très bien, merci. Et vous?
Ça va bien. How are things with your new adventure of YouTube? You seem to be enjoying yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I picked the worst possible time to go independent. But so far, it's going well. It's exciting and terrifying. Well, you know, you've been both freelancing with companies on and off for the years, and there's benefits and drawbacks to both. I probably should have picked a better time to do it, but other than that, it's going pretty well.
Well, it seems to be from the outside, I can tell you that. So keep up whatever you're doing because...
oh, thank you.
Yeah, no, I was super excited to see it, and we're going to speak about some stuff that we did get a chance to cover last week. Regarding the Worldwide Developer Conference, Apple's big developer conference, which I think is definitely the most impressive virtual event that used to be a real event that anybody's put yet together. Like, it feels seamless to me. Like, I'm sure it's very different for developers who used to attend, but as somebody who's always mostly watched from the sidelines, occasionally has been at the actual keynote, it didn't seem that difference, you know?
You were probably the same way. I'm like, what camera are they using? What lens are they using? Craig looks 9 feet tall. Wait a minute, Tim is moving in and out. What are they? That was a good production.
I mean, it was pre-recorded, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, we talked about this last week, and I know you heard, you listened to the podcast.
Yes.
We covered some of our trial and tribulations, Nick and I, who was my guest last week, about the Apple Silicon transition. And I personally don't have too many tribulations, but we have some more information this week to talk about. And then I know I'd love to talk about this iOS app and iPadOS app on Mac, and what you as a Mac user and me as a Mac user, what we think this is going to end up being. And for those of you listening right now and going, oh no, more Apple stuff, hang tight though. We've got a whole bunch of cool phone news and Android news, some OnePlus stuff. So sit tight. We need to go over this because this is a big deal.
And it's not like this isn't going to happen everywhere. I mean, we've already seen Microsoft experimenting with some customization on ARM. Google makes their own server chips, and they've been, experimenting with making more silicon for phones. So it's an industry trend, and I think it's fascinating overall to see the change from Wintel to some form of Nix and some form of ARM and some form of WebKit-based browser in our pocket. So different than a decade ago.
And I mean, we have Chromebooks running ARM too, right? If anybody arguably has done a really good job with the transition to ARM, it's Chrome. Like, I mean, it's completely seamless. If you get a Chromebook that's ARM based, unless it doesn't have enough RAM, it's actually pretty okay. So yeah.
And we started, to your point, we started seeing more sessions come out after the keynote, and one of them was just showing how like the new boot process is going to work. And instead of having to remember these arcane keys to hold down to go to recovery mode or safe mode, you just hold down the power Touch ID button, and it gives you a visual menu. And if you destroy your system, there's a concealed partition that can restore everything for you. And we know that Apple and Google and everybody's working towards portless, remote restored devices. And I think all of this is a huge confluence. And when you make the silicon, you can literally design it for what you want the product experience to be. And that's often when it's better for customers, when it's not like, oh, we have this technology, what can we do with it? But this is a product we want to make. What technology do we need to make it real?
I think for me, the takeaway from last week's transition announcement is that we're seeing a very similar structure to the transition as we did with Intel, with the PowerPC to Intel, and Intel to Apple Silicon, ARM, which is, they're still running ARM cores on the CPU side, at least for now.
Well, so they're custom core. So it's hard. It's so hard to talk about because ARM makes their own core design, and people buy them, and they're called Cortex, and they run them in a bunch of servers and a bunch of devices. And Apple only licenses the instruction set and makes their own cores. So they're running the ARM ISA, but they're not running the ARM core design. And we don't have enough terminology to properly describe this because we're used to like Intel, AMD, x86.
Yeah.
And like ARM is not the same sort of thing. It's such an ugly beast to talk about.
And Qualcomm's done that too. They're basically creating instruction compatible chips.
Yeah.
And in the past, I've also licensed entire ARM designs in terms of CPU. So and GPU as well, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. I know that Apple used PowerVR for a while, yeah?
Yes.
And that's ARM essentially, right? Okay.
Yes. And now they're making their own custom, but they're still compatible. And Apple like names them after like they're like Typhoon and Mistral and Tornado, and like they name them after storms, which is always interesting to me.
It's kind of cool. So for me, the big thing that stood out was I mean, Universal Binaries 2.0 was a no-brainer.
Yes.
Right? And the second thing was Rosetta was, for me, a no-brainer, but I wasn't necessarily expecting it. Yeah. And I tell you why, and you heard this on the show, my biggest tribulation on this transition is not the transition to ARM or to Apple Silicon, is the transition I haven't made yet. And the transition so many Mac users haven't made yet, which is the dumbest, most annoying transition from 32-bit to 64-bit. Yeah. I was kind of really hoping that with Rosetta 2, they would announce, oh, hey, by the way, we'll support 32-bit binaries too. Because that's all. I don't actually believe why. I'm going to ask you this, Rene, because it's annoying me.
Go ahead.
Like it's annoying the crap out of me. Why didn't Apple wait one more year to switch to 64-bit? Why did they just say we're doing it all at once? Because Catalina has been such a mess for so many people. Yeah. I'm not talking you. I could adapt. You obviously have adapted because you prepared. Because
but
you're
can't
smart.
use like level builders from
well, there
Valve
you go.
if I wanted
so
to.
You
can't use audio plugins.
SOL.
I mean,
okay. So my point is like, why did they not either combine them? And I think this transition is on paper going to go perfectly because I think we're already seeing these benchmarks we're going to talk about. But for most people, that's not the reality. For Theo, who's running a MacBook Air from 2013 or 14 or whatever, running High Sierra or whatever right now, they're going to lose so much stuff if I buy them a new ARM Mac, and even I will. So how does Apple handle it? Does Apple care? Does Apple understand that not everyone is completely 100% on the Apple ecosystem of apps?
Yeah, I think the 32-bit transition was a huge mistake in the way that it was architected, because they essentially gave developers 10 years. They started it with, I forget if it was Leopard or it was Lion, but they started the transition back in the Steve Jobs days, and they just kept saying we're deprecating it, and developers don't care if they're saying like this is a multi-year thing. They're like, okay, we'll do it when you're actually serious about it. And over the course of that time, a lot of them lost the engineers that were maintaining the 32-bit. Like they literally can't fix it if they want to, because the people who wrote it aren't even there anymore. And so we're stuck. And I think their hope was that by doing it last year, it would incentivize developers to do it during Catalina, so it would be all ready to go when we got to the Big Sur based ARM machines. But because they just don't have the resources and they don't have the market to do it, we sort of end up with the worst of both worlds.
And so I'm not too worried about the transition, frankly. But I'm worried about the actual real transition that so many people haven't done yet and are going to have to do. And I have a feeling that the message for me at WWDC was that they've really lit a fire under Adobe and Microsoft to at least get those things fixed, which still doesn't help me because I'm running CS5. Like you're going to say, well, come on, you got to yes, I've thought about it for years, but I don't need more functionality. It
works, right?
Like it works. I paid my money on this. And I understand Adobe's new business model, but imagine, right? Like two of us now in the household that work together professionally would have to buy these subscription licenses for apps we use once in a very, like I use Photoshop maybe once a month. Like I don't really use anything else. And you know, I think a lot of people are in that boat. And I don't want to be like, oh, well, sometimes it's nice to use Premiere. I have it, right? Like I don't, but I could. And so
you could,
now with these packages, I looked at the pricing and I was like, no, this doesn't make sense for my business.
So I wonder, I have this conspiracy theory, and I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat, but my conspiracy theory is it's such a different world now, because back then it was crucial to have Microsoft and Adobe support your transition. But now, if Microsoft doesn't, just people with Macs are going to use Google Docs. And if Adobe doesn't, people with Macs are going to go to like Infinity Designer or Pixelmator or Final Cut Pro. So they have more incentive to keep their customers, I think, before than they had to actually cooperate and do the ports.
Yeah, I think you're right on Microsoft for sure. Like everybody's pretty comfortable with Google Docs these days.
Yeah.
But I think that for Creative Suite, I think that's a sticking point because, I personally can't think of, as you came up with two replacements Photoshop, and I'm aware they exist, but I've never even tried them. Like, do they fit in my workflow? Am I happy with them? I don't know. Thankfully, I don't have too many plugins, so I'm not too worried about that. Or like DaVinci
Resolve versus Premiere.
Yeah, right. Like, that would be a big jump. But my point is that's my biggest fear is it's not like Nick said, there are old people who they have never done that transition to the cloud. And part of the reason they bought a Mac is because, their kids set it up for them, bought them CS5, CS6, whatever, and got them like Microsoft Office 2008 or whatever. And they've been upgrading their Macs with this payload in the background of 32-bit apps for years. And they might just have bought a Mac just prior to Catalina that ran all this stuff like a champ.
Yeah.
And now 2-3 years from now, they're going to go out to the Apple store, put their big fat money down and buy the new MacBook Air 13. And they're going to come home and there's going to be a lot of very angry people. And I'm not sure Apple's aware of that. I think with iOS and iPadOS devices, it's a lot easier to pull people in to update them,
it's
to
almost
keep
invisible.
them, right? But I think with the Mac, I think they're going to have a lot of problem. And I think if you are right now an IT person running your own like small shop in a small town doing computer repair, this is a business. You need to be like offering this service. You're going to make a lot of money.
And this is the thing. It's like Apple is absolutely ruthless and savage about ditching like older technologies so they don't have to drag it with them into the future. But sometimes they're a little premature about doing it. And then Microsoft on the other side is like, maybe Windows ME this year we'll think about, dropping ties to that. I just like there's got to be a good balance in the middle. Like you shouldn't support people forever because otherwise they'll never move forward. But you shouldn't just cut the legs out from under them when they're trying to run for the touchdown.
Okay, so I'm glad that my perception on last week's show, and for the audience, I really recommend you at least listen to the first 40 minutes of last week's show. We can't go over all the stuff Nick and I talked about, but a lot of it is around this fear of the transition and what it means. Now we have a bit more data this week because of the benchmarks, and I'm glad that you are the godfather of Apple news coverage is also going like, this is a sticky point, because I just don't know how do you elegantly drag these people. Like if Apple had, with the Catalina transition last year, had like some sort of system that automatically matched up people with apps that were deprecated with new apps, instead it just lists them all, right? When you do an update them, and it just goes like meh, like ASCII meh, like
shrug emoji.
Yeah, I don't know. It's very interesting. So my question to you is, you and I have no doubt this transition is going to be smooth, and I have no doubt performance on these ARM Macs is going to be incredible.
Yeah, it's
and not just performance speed, but performance battery life, performance built-in connectivity,
performance efficiency. That's the new trendy kid term.
Yeah. We're going to see at the low end some very fanless devices, and at the high end, very small cooling, very minimal cooling that's going to bring performance up on ARM like we've never seen before.
And unified memory. I mean,
oh my God, it's going to be amazing. Do you think that what we're seeing with these, so maybe we should summarize it. Maybe you can talk about this more. What is the kind of the gist that we've seen? Some of these developer kits, these DTKs have landed in the hands of developers. They are based on the A12Z Bionic, or not Bionic, whatever it's called, chip.
No, it's still Bionic,
which is a 2-year-old design now from the original skinny Mac Pro, like the skinny bezel Mac Pro, and not Mac Pro, iPad Pro. And here we are. These are Mac Mini lookalike. They have all the ports you want, and the benchmarks emulated on Rosetta 2, so emulating x86 64-bit on Big Sur, running on ARM in Apple Silicon is very impressive.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so these chips are 2 years old. Apple has activated. Previously, they were just hard to get the yield up, so they didn't. They any chip that had 7 active GPU cores was good enough to ship with the 2018 iPad Pro. By the 2020 iPad Pro, they got up to having all 8 cores activated, but they're still binning the chips. So the best chips go to the iPad Pro, and not best chips are going into the developer kits. So you're basically getting, a slightly less performant version of the iPad Pro chip. And I love watching Steve Troughton-Smith when all this stuff goes down because he's so on top of it. And immediately he's like, "Oh, under Rosetta, it's outperforming Windows on the Surface 10." Sorry, the Surface X. I can't pronounce the word X or the letter 10 anymore, Miriam.
Yeah, I know.
This is what Apple has done to me.
I'm sorry. It's okay. I have a lot of phones that have X in them that are not Apple's iPhones, and so I have to do the mental switch. It's like when I switch.
But even Apple has an iPhone 10 with an A10 with an A12X chip in it. Like, it makes no sense.
It's simple, Rene. It's like when you go from a Chromebook to a Mac and you have to go with Control or Command. Yeah. Okay, you do that seamlessly, right?
Yes.
It takes me one mistake before I switch, right? And then I do it, and then I go back with. It's the same thing.
But with Chrome, you got to hold down Command Q, and I forget, so I let go the first time, then I do it properly the second time. So it takes me 3 times as long every time.
Anyway, so what I was getting to is I think those numbers are very impressive, and right now the HCX chip, which is Qualcomm's ARM-based design that's used in PCs, AC PCs as they call them, always connected PCs that several manufacturers make now. Microsoft has the Surface X. There's a bunch of stuff, right? Like Samsung has one. They're all Windows 10 on ARM, and they run 64-bit apps native, and they emulate 32-bit apps only. From Intel. So you can take a 64-bit Intel app and bring it over. But we've seen the emulation on those be okay, manageable, but just as a crutch. It's not really something you want to do. But from what the benchmarks look like on the DTK, we're looking at performance that as good as native on Qualcomm's chips running Windows 10 ARM. So wow. Do you think it's just a 64-bit thing versus a 32-bit thing, or do you think it's just better? They're used to doing this, right?
Yeah, no, I think the problem and maybe it's not a problem. The best way to put we just saw Qualcomm announce new wearable silicon. And the problem is it's still based on their older 14 nanometer phone silicon. And the ugly truth about it is it's expensive to make chips. And if you're a merchant silicon vendor, you've got to make profit on those chips. So it behooves them to have the same technology on the market longer because it better defrays the cost of developing it. Just for people not familiar with silicon, you can do anything as long as you have time and or money, some combination of those two things. The less time you have, the more money you need.
I think that's true of pretty much anything, right?
Totally true. So the thing is that Apple doesn't make money on the chips. Like, they can lose money on chips as long as they make money on the whole device. So they can literally spend to make whatever they want, and almost no other company in the world can do that. So Qualcomm still has to sell those chips to Microsoft for the Surface or to Samsung, and they've got to make money on those. And it's such a more complicated proposition where Apple's like, run as fast as you can. We'll put margin on the iPhone. It's fine. Just make us the fastest chips in the world. And that's what Johnny Sarugi's team, that's their mandate. Yeah. And that's what they've been doing. And it must be great as an engineer to work in that environment.
And that's what we're seeing. And I'm not here to knock Qualcomm or Microsoft or Samsung for their Windows 10 AC PCs. I've used some of these.
They're great at some things. Their modem's way better than Apple's.
If you run 64-bit apps on those, which I do, it's great. And especially the new version of Edge is really, really sweet on 64-bit ARM Windows 10. That browser, I mean, we all know it's essentially Chromium under the hood, but it's damn great. So I feel like, this shows where Apple's going with this. And again, it shows Apple's expertise, and not just as you making great silicon, as you know, but it's this Rosetta stuff that this emulation, they know how to do this. It's the third time they're doing it. And, wow.
And it's one of those things, like, because people complain a lot that Apple doesn't work with NVIDIA, for example, and they can't get CUDA cores. But NVIDIA is a hugely successful company, and NVIDIA wants to commoditize PCs so that you have your NVIDIA card and it runs on no matter what PC you have, where Apple wants to commoditize the graphics so that you have a Mac with Metal and it runs on whatever graphics cores it finds. It just dispatches between CPU, neural engine, and graphics cores. And that sucks for people. And those two people are not flinching. But it lets Apple do stuff like this, because whether it's Apple silicon or AMD silicon, they will get out of the way and let Apple write to the metal, and let, like, for things like anything that's high performance, they will get the entire stack out of the way and let you write directly to the chips. So for like VR tasks or emulation, hypervisor is built in to the silicon for them, and they've got accelerators for it. And it's when everyone else is out of your way, you get a substantial boost to performance.
Yeah, so I'm stoked, honestly. You know, I still have, as I said in the show last week, a 12-inch MacBook, the original one, not the second version. And it still runs just fine. It's not fast, but if I keep the tabs count low, and it's it's the higher end version, I maxed it out at the time.
M7.
It's honestly just fine. But I can't wait to get something in that form factor that is got built-in 5G, has, you know, has this new chipset that would just fly circles around. Not run, but fly.
Well, I had that computer too, and like the thing that got me is, like, they came out with the same time that they did an update to the iPad Pro, and the iPad Pro, because Intel was so late for so long, like they didn't build H.265 support into their chips for a long, long time. So Apple said, okay, you know, we'll put a T2 chip in there, but whatever. I could do 3 streams of 4K on a rinky-dinky iPad, and I couldn't get one to work on the Core on the M5 version of the 12-inch MacBook.
For sure,
and it's just like.
Yeah, and that's what I've been saying to people who have come to me in the last couple of years saying, hey, what do you think of this eventual ARM transition? I'm like, have you played with an iPad Pro?
Yeah.
Have you rendered video in iMovie on iPad Pro?
And also, it's cool.
Why doesn't Apple have a Final Cut on the iPad yet, by the way?
I think that's a Final Cut Pro Xcode. I think it's similar to what Adobe has been doing with Photoshop. They're just doing it privately and not in public. Mm-hmm. And that's iPads are still RAM constrained, so you're still constrained at the highest end to 6 gigabytes of RAM. And also the interface before the Magic Keyboard was constrained. So I think they're trying to think through, and Adobe will tell you it's real Photoshop, but it's not full Photoshop. And the decision-making process about what features to move over, and also, is it an independent app or is it an app that works with the desktop? So you're working on your project, you're working on your app in Xcode or your movie in Final Cut, and then part of that gets pushed to the iPad, you work on it, but it also goes back to the computer. And I think those are a bunch of decisions that we've seen Adobe, I don't want to say struggle with, because they've been working really hard on it.
I was going to say struggle with, because I think it's true. Like, I don't think we're being mean by saying that. Adobe's had a really hard time making this work well, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm betting Apple's doing the same thing, just not doing it in public.
So speaking, this is a perfect segue for the next topic. I mean, our takeaway, generally speaking, on this is that the hardware is going to kick ass, the emulation is going to work. This is all rosy, and the biggest challenge for people is going to be what we talked about last week, which is the switch to. Yeah. If you haven't done the switch to Catalina, please do it soon, because you're going to be really in a bag of hurt next time you buy a Mac,
or you're going to be on that Intel Mac for a long time.
Yeah, damn. But at the same time, you know. We are just talking about this right now. Maybe the solution to some of these missing 32-bit apps is, if you only use, like me, Photoshop for a few little retouching things every now and then because you're familiar with the workflow, maybe you can download the iPad version, right? And you install that on your Mac ARM, and boom, there it is. You have like a very simplified, very minimal version of Photoshop you can run. I don't know how much they charge for that app. I don't know if is it subscription based as well?
I think all of their stuff is. Yeah, I don't think you can get around this. But again, like there's a whole bunch of really, really good non-Adobe apps these days that I didn't even look at until I started seeing the price of the, when the intro discount expired, and I started looking around at what the pricing was like. And they've come up, like Pixelmator, and a lot of them are using the neural engines now too, and are doing things that Adobe hasn't done yet. Like Adobe, they're like things like Smart Fill are amazing on Adobe, but when you're harnessing like neural engines built into the silicon, some of these apps are doing amazing things.
Well, that's maybe your ticket, folks. And you know what to do about Microsoft Office. I mean, first of all, you have Office in the cloud if you really need it. It's free. And secondly, forget it. Just Google Docs. I mean, I know this is a big bone of contention for a lot of people. Yes, Microsoft Excel standalone on your PC or Mac is a much bigger truck, as it were, than the small pickup truck or the very large pickup truck, but that's not a full-on truck that is Google Sheets. But at the same time, I feel that for most people, for the kind of people that I'm talking about, that are casual Microsoft Office users today, I think that using Google Docs is going to be fine. So that's less of a transition. And what app can you think of that maybe at our level as creators have been, like for me, I have like all of these legacy 30, like if I look in it's crazy how much little image batch processing, rename processing. All of these little GUI based apps that I have that I just won't work anymore. So I'm trying to figure out what.
Like I used to use Levelator for years and it was like abandonware and it stopped working. And now it's like RX7 costs, like, what is it, $1,000? I mean, it's a tough world.
Easy Batch Photo, I spent money on that. I don't know if they have a 64-bit version yet, but that's one of my big tools. But anyway, look, the reality is I might just keep an old Mac around. That's an Intel Mac running, high.
Well, everyone has a gaming PC because you can't game on the Mac. So all you have to do is just use those things on like you run Office on the gaming PC.
You're laughing, but fine. Theo already said, maybe I'll just keep my old Mac when that happens to run the games. And I was like, right now, by the way, I don't know if you know this, I don't know if I've told you this, Theo is running Civilization 3 on a virtual machine that is running Mac OS, the last version of OS that used Rosetta.
Oh, wow.
Which one is that? I don't know, Snow Leopard?
Oh, yeah. Snow Leopard.
So Theo will boot a virtual machine running Snow Leopard, very lightweight version of Snow Leopard, like bare install, that then boots into Civ 3.
That's so good.
With a DVD virtual image. And they run this at the same time as they run Chrome and Firefox, multiple tabs on a Core i7 MacBook Air from 2013 with 8 gigs of RAM. And they're hurting right now because they really need to get like a new computer. And at the same time, I'm like, honey, I don't know, should we buy you an Intel? Like, I'm also at the point where like, should I buy like the last year of
the last Intel, right?
No, the last year of the Core i7 Air that has a MagSafe still. Because that won't come with Catalina, right? Because, Anyway, so I don't know what we're going to do. But this is what we're doing. So they already said, no, I think I might just I might just keep that computer as my game computer or something.
But that's the thing that's so interesting to me is because like Apple for a long time couldn't get ultra low power memory from Intel either. So they built like memory compression and they created these ultra fast SSD swaps. So it would be almost transparent that you didn't have a lot of RAM. And now we're getting a bunch of benefits from that on all ranges of mobile devices that are highly RAM constrained. Yeah. So it's like a benevolent cycle.
So what do you think this iOS apps and iPadOS apps on the Mac, ARM-based Macs looks like? Because this has been something that's been talked about. What was that technology called that was experimental for all this time?
Catalyst, thank you. So UIKit on Mac.
Why would you... I don't understand why you would do that unless you had a touchscreen. Like, to me, I get it if there was a touchscreen, kind of, but then I'm worried that Mac developers are going to be like,
lazy.
What? Well, not just lazy, but like, why even bother making Mac versions? Like for utilities like Easy Batch Creator, if you have access to the file system somehow, you don't really need to create a version for the Mac anymore. So what do you think is going to happen here, and how is that going to work?
So there's two theories. Like I have this long-standing theory too. I'll just back up for a second. I think that a lot of people looked at Big Sur and it was a Rorschach test. And if they've always wanted a touchscreen apps, they're like, oh, there's so much more space now. It's so much more touchable. And if they're waiting desperately for Apple's VR and AR stuff, they're like, oh, they got rid of the sharp corners. It's way friendlier for AR and VR. And if you really like the iPad, you're like, oh, it looks so much more like an iPad. They're going to merge. And if you're a traditional Mac person, you're like, just stop everything that you're doing, sit down, we're having a talk. And I think that's like, so I want to keep my own bias out of it, but I think part of it for Apple is that it answers the casual gaming question for them, because a lot of those people, they're not even going to bother putting in the Catalyst work for it. And I think that's why they showed Monument Valley as their demonstration app. It's sort of like, a lot of you are nervous about gaming on the Mac right now, but every game you have on the iPad will just run on the new Mac. And that takes off at least the not as loud minority on Twitter, definitely, but the majority of people who've grown up playing iPad apps.
Yeah, but then how do they interface with these apps? I mean, the thing about playing an iPad app, especially with the iPad's vast high-res screen, is that ability to touch these controls, direct access to the Chrome, right? Whereas you now have the mouse or the trackpad, which, as delightful as Apple's mice and trackpads are, is still one more level of, latency in the experience. And I'm not quite convinced that this is going to be I'm not saying Apple needs to put my touchscreens in their Macs. I'm just kind of questioning why even have this.
I hope they do, because it just seems like what they've been doing on the iPad is philosophically they said that every form of input should be a first-class citizen, starting with the accessibility team and then moving into the Springboard team. So we saw accessibility gestures. Now we have full trackpad and cursor support. They've done voice control, so you can use your voice to control almost everything in the interface. And all of those things, for accessibility, but just for human beings, we should be able to make our stuff do what we want the way we want it. And I think the Mac deserves the same thing. Because you were at Infinite Loop, you go up there and there's these huge iMacs with these huge buttons to sign in, and the first thing I do is tap the button, and I feel like an idiot. Yeah. And people who are multi-touch native, kids who grew up in the age of iPad, they just think the screens are broken, and that's not good.
And I mean, you know what it is, right? When we go to the Infinite Loop, they were actually testing us. The iMac camera is doing an eye scan to see where on the screen we're looking, getting a map, and then they actually have a touch layer on that iMac. You don't know it, but they register where you touched on the screen, and it's a Catalyst app. You don't really know it, and you didn't know you're part of an experiment, Rene.
Yeah. It's like the elevator closed door button. It doesn't work, but they want to see how often you press it.
That's right. Oh my God. Yeah, so I mean, look, I'm just a little puzzled by that. I do you feel as a longtime Mac Apple person, do you feel a little trepidous about this? I mean, I'm not saying that the two OSs and app ecosystems can't converge. I think it can be done well, maybe, but I'm feeling like the Mac, as Jobs said, the Mac is a truck. We all use it that way. We know what it does. We have workflows. We're professionals. We're getting stuff done. Don't mess with us. Don't mess with us, Apple, right? This feels to me we're adding power windows to your Ford pickup truck. Do I really need that? Maybe
no, but I think that's it. I think you nailed it there, because when people when people on Twitter, and I hate using Twitter as a punching bag, but when people on Twitter talk about this, they look at it in terms of the components. They're like, oh, they're both running Apple Silicon. They're both running the same basic Core OS features now. They both have very similar, even the icons look the same. The UIs are similar. They're lying. They must be converging these things. And I think the way Apple looks at it is we make $5 billion a quarter on the iPad, and we make $5 billion a quarter on the Mac, and we're not going to give up either of those monies until they really slide down. But we want to make it much more convenient for us to maintain, much more efficient, from the silicon to the components to the interface for us to maintain, and much easier for you to just buy more Apple stuff and be familiar with. So for them, it is exactly that. It's, well, if we take a truck and we give it all the amenities of a car, like the nice seats, the nice interiors, the power windows, people buy a lot more trucks that way.
And that's been the success story of the truck world. Trucks today are loaded. When you look at the average selling price of a truck, I keep telling this to people who look at my Tesla Model 3 and go, whoa, you have a Model 3, ooh. And I'm like, dude, I have a long-range rear-wheel drive, relatively not the base model, but I have a relatively mid-range Model 3. And the average US pickup truck costs more than my car. Yep. And they look at me and they're like, really? And I'm like, hello, I think you're
and they're bestsellers.
Yes, absolutely. And it's clearly shown that people, and I'm not saying people shouldn't want that. Maybe I should get off my lawn and stop yelling at the clouds or something. But my point is that it's to me, my fear is more I don't want the developers to start using iOS and iPadOS apps as a crutch.
Same.
Unless it's done with all the things I'm expecting, like deep integration with Spotlight, deep integration with the file system, because that's the thing. How when you run Android apps on a Chromebook, it's I can run photos on the Chromebook, Google Photos, right, as an Android app, and at the same time I can run it in a window in Chrome, right? And they don't talk to each other. Yeah. One doesn't know what's in my photo gallery, quote unquote, on Android, because that's siloed. That's and that's my fear is you're going to airdrop between the Mac OS apps and the, it's weird. But that's also why we have, iCloud, obviously. But you're not always on the internet. If I'm on an airplane and I want to use some like Photoshop for iPadOS and edit a photo real quick, how's that going to work? How is Apple going to make that work for me,
Yeah. Oh, and I was really happy last week on the show because everyone's like, Apple's copying this from Android, Android's copying this from Apple. All of us nerds know that Nokia invented everything in 1802. Like we're just busy. We're just we're rediscovering it now. It's like archaeology on Migo. That's all we're doing now.
It's kind of true, right? It's like, your dialer can be used for Skype, but you don't have to install
remember
Skype.
Everyone was going live on N95s. Like forget like going live on YouTube. It's like
I know I was doing live streaming as quick on my N95 before the iPhone existed on 2G and 3G networks. Kids these days, they have no idea, Rene.
And widgets all over the screen
with their TikTok videos.
I know. Everything old is new again.
I know, it's so great. Let's switch gears to some of the news items. I think this is, the takeaway here is that we really don't know how this is going to pan out, and that you have to keep an open mind and hope for the best. Yeah. I really think that the Mac developer community is very, very strong and opinionated and really wants the Mac to succeed. And that might be what keeps everything going. But there are going to definitely be some developers who are going to say, we're throwing in the towel. We're just going to maintain the iPadOS and iOS versions. And
goodbye. We're making Chrome OS apps now.
That is something we need to be prepared for, in the same way as we now have had 10 years to switch to 64-bit apps, and none of us has somehow managed to do that properly on the Mac, right? Oh, man. So I want to talk quickly about an Apple-related topic that is come up that you did a video about. I'm going to link in the show notes to your video. This whole rumor that the iPhone 12s are going to be coming, with no headphones doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah. A lot of phones come with no headphones these days. We already lost the adapter last year, but I think that made sense in a weird way. True wireless earbuds, they're literally, I now have a drawer designated true wireless earbuds because I get so many devices sent to me, and they're all pretty decent. And so I just don't care anymore. If I want to do critical listening, I do it with these headphones, my DT990 Beyerdynamic. But what this charger thing, what I think you nailed it in your video is that I think they need to have a voucher in the phone box that says, there's no charger. You might have one. Your 5-watt charger will work fine, but here's a thing where you get 50% off or whatever the 20-watt USB-C charger that we sell now or something. Because I think it's not so much we don't have USB chargers around. It's there are just a lot of shitty chargers out there.
The dollar store charger, whatever it happens to be. Yeah.
And then there's the fear of the charging slowly. And then finally, the big thing is, which cable would they put in the box? USB Type-C or USB Type-A? Because I think my gut tells me USB-A, simply because even a lot of modern Android phones ship with USB-A to C cables in the box. So,
well, people in the Apple community forget that most iPhone users use Windows, and a lot of Windows computers are still USB-A. Like even now, only the more recent ones. You still argue about Surfaces having USB-C ports. It's true. We live in a different world. The thing about this, and I will acknowledge this because I get yelled at when I talked about Apple removing the headphone jack. It's like HTC removed it from the G1 and the Touch back in 2007, and you never give them credit.
They never had it. It's not that they removed it. Like, come on.
Well, they had that dongle box. But then yesterday we were talking about this, and they're like, Moto removed it from the Motorola G years ago, and I'm like, I can't. Look, I'm gonna see that Apple's not first at anything. That's fine, okay? But they sell so many phones that when they do it, it impacts a lot of people, and because headlines with Apple in them sell a lot of papers, we're going to hear about it in a way that we never heard about it with other vendors. So I'm gonna deal with the pain that's in front of me. It's like my philosophy.
Yeah, look, I'm not opposed to it. I think a voucher would go a long way, because if I'm spending $1,000 on a phone, what is $10 on half cost? Say they do a really good, nice thing, and they sell the 20-watt charger for $19. Just give, I know that's a low price, but even if they put a voucher in there and you can buy it for $9 or $10, like, come on, like it's the price of a freaking latte and a half in San Francisco. Like, I know San Francisco is not a reference point, but like, come on, like, it's not a huge deal. But at the same time, it's interesting for Apple, because it's that pull and push and pull, as you said in your video, like the environmental positives, right, versus the user experience friction, transparent, like lovely Appleness of the experience. And
it's marketing. It's like when at WWDC, they were doing so well, and then they said the stand cost $1,000. And if they had just said, if you don't need the stand, we'll take $1,000 off the cost.
Exactly.
Nobody would have reacted badly.
Yeah.
And this is the same thing. It's like, let's say they maintain prices. They go to 5G, and a lot of other vendors have raised their prices with 5G, and they say, we're not doing that. Oh, but you have to pay us $40. Nobody's going to care they didn't raise prices for 5G.
I really hope it's not $40. They need to keep that charger. I mean, if I were them, that would be why you need that voucher. Is because, look, people want a fast charge, and people want a charger they can trust. And even though you might have a whole bunch of 5-watt chargers that are official Apple chargers around the house, a lot of people do, it's still going to be slow. And so, it's tricky because, look, the reason Android phones haven't done this yet, because Android phones are in my opinion, much better candidates for not shipping with the charger. If you look around my house, I have USB-C, PD, 65-watt chargers in almost every room that I can plug my Mac, my iPad, and my Android phones into, and fast charge over PD, and it'll self-adjust between, like 5-watt charging all the way to like 65 to 90 watt in some cases.
But remember when Nintendo tried this, people lost their minds.
And to me, that seems like Google, Android phones would be a better candidate than iPhone. But the iPhone, it's interesting because, yes, on one hand, a lot of people have chargers, but on the other hand, you kind of count on the charger coming because you lose one and you have a spare and blah, 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 and sometimes they break. And I don't know. It's like...
So I would hope, like, my beautiful dream for this, and it won't happen because even if it only costs Apple $2, it's $2 times 200 million phones, so it's still real money.
Yeah.
But mine would just be whether stores are open by then or not. When you order, there's a checkbox that says I need a charger,
and it's completely free.
Yeah, it's off by default, but if you check it, it's like it's either free or it's at cost. It's like, like you said, $10.
Yeah.
And then you check it. Same way like Amazon does, like, do you need the full retail packaging or can we do the eco-friendly packaging?
And do you think they give you a choice of cable then, or will it be USB-A? Because right now it's still USB-A unless you buy, is the
Pro is USB-C and which makes it more confusing.
Oh God.
Because they still have the rinky-dinky 5-watt charger in the 11.
Oh man, yeah, that's right. I have a regular 11. It came with a Ridinky charger.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So I don't know. I think this is going to happen. Like, this is a very Apple thing to do.
It's a very Apple thing.
And the environmental benefits absolutely exist. I'm not as concerned for the Apple users as I am concerned for the people maybe switching to iOS and worrying that they spent a lot of money on this phone and not
just like the normal people, like not the tech people.
Yeah, not understanding that even though it's USB and they can use the Type A wall wart from their Samsung Galaxy from last year and plug that A to Lightning cable into it, some people might worry about that. I think the most Luddite user actually doesn't know that you can interchange it. Have you noticed that they'll be like, I know I need to use the charger that says Samsung because I have a Samsung phone, right? Yeah. Because they still remember the days when people had custom connectors and stuff.
Or they forget they plug into computers too. Because a lot of people are like, well, my phone will be dead and I won't be able to charge. And like, there's still like penetration for computers is huge and most of them have USB ports. So
I mean, yeah. And to those listeners who are going to say, Miriam, of course, you know why Android phones all ship with the charger days, because everyone has a custom fast charging solution. And, you never know if the person has the fast charging system at the other end. Definitely. I understand that. I'm just saying that they could, if they really wanted to, slow their horses a little bit because nobody needs 65-watt charging on an Oppo phone, okay? Nobody does. Like, once you reach about 30-watt charging, you're good. Trust me, you're just fine on a phone. Your battery's not
happy. Batteries are not happy with heat.
So 65 watt you don't need, and then I question it. PD does 30 watt really well. Why doesn't everybody use PD at that point? I mean, there are advantages. Like what Oppo's doing, for example, Rene, is really interesting. They have dual cells in the phone. They charge them in parallel, and they put all the charging electronics in the brick so the heat doesn't get generated in the phone. And they actually use low current charging and high voltage to prevent heating again. It's very clever, but like maybe PD needs to evolve to kind of like embrace this technology somehow. That I just don't think is ever going to happen, but let's see what happens. But that's definitely a big piece of news that's been floating around. The other big piece of news for all of us mobile tech lovers, since my audience tends to be pretty savvy, is that OnePlus announced the name of their next lineup of phone / maybe even the phone itself, called the OnePlus Nord.
It's for Canada, right? The whole name is for Canada.
That's right. I was going to say, well, last week I laughed about it because I was like, that's such a shitty name. And I didn't say, I don't really, don't get me wrong. Nord by itself is not a bad name. It's just OnePlus and Nord together just kind of seems to conflict somehow. Like, Nord, there's a company that makes keyboards called Nord, and they make really lovely keyboards. There is, of course, NordVPN.
Do people know it's French for North?
I don't think they do. And also, Nordic, it's used, it's also used in English as kind of like, a shortened version of Nordic, which means anything from the north. And so it's interesting. It's like, I find that name choice weird. And of course, this phone is India, Europe only. So for Europe, the Nord works, name works well. There's a lot of Nordic countries, right? But India, it's like, do they even know? I mean, I guess in in parts of India, in the Himalayas, it's cold. Yeah. But like, I don't know. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, do they
have a Nord track? They're fine.
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. I feel like, what's your take in general on this whole OnePlus and how they're trying to reinvent themselves as a less than $500 brand again?
So I because I used to work in marketing, I'm always suspicious of every company marketing. And I'm always like, did you just new Coke us? Did you take away our classic Coke with a full flagship priced phone just so you could come back with like the new Coke, and now you have the classic Coke again? We're like, oh, OnePlus is back, baby. And you get like so much acclaim that you wouldn't have gotten if you just stuck at that price to begin with. But I think that they just need, practically they need to have phones in those price points. And if they can get as much marketing out of those phones as possible, I think it's great for them.
I mean, I think this was a long time in the making, despite the fact that OnePlus had this OnePlus X, which was a mid-range phone for the 1 year. In addition to their flagship that year. The flagship at the time was the OnePlus 2, and the OnePlus X was a $299 phone or something like that. That was a mid-ranger, and it was a lovely phone, but it didn't sell well. And after that, they were very clear to us every time they talked to us, and I say PR, and both Carl Pei and Pete Lau, the execs, were very clear, we're not making mid-range, we're not going there again. It wasn't profitable, it wasn't worthwhile for us. And not profitable is not the word they use, but it made it sound it wasn't worth their while. And so, but at the same time, prices of phones, especially Qualcomm chip phones that are at the higher end, have gone up exponentially in the last couple of years, and particularly this year.
Spending power has gone down.
With the 865, and with COVID and the economy in particular, spending power is down. Yeah. And I think it makes perfect sense. And I'm not saying that they decide to do this because of all of this. I think it's very much something they were planning to do, starting to see how expensive those chips were getting, saying we can get 90%, 80% of the experience and performance out of a 765 chip. So let's do that. And I don't fault them for it. I actually also think that you have to always remember that OnePlus is part of the BBK group that also makes Oppo and Vivo and Realme and IQ, and there's a bunch of other brands.
Basically half of everything.
And yes. And so there is a phone right now out there called the Oppo Reno 3 Pro 5G, which is spec-wise identical to what the leaks are on the OnePlus Nord. And if you pay attention, this has always been the case. There's always a OnePlus phone that's a slight variant on an Oppo phone. This year's OnePlus 8 Pro, the big mother, the fastest, nicest phone they make, which is my daily driver right now, is actually a detuned version of an even more expensive phone from Oppo called the Find X2 Pro. Yeah. And I reviewed both of these phones, so check that out on Hot Hardware and Geekspin. But the point I'm making is that I think that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing safety in numbers and economies of scale within the BBK group, where they're like, hey, maybe we can find a way to not compromise that OnePlus experience of speed, but bringing the cost down to where it should be. And I think we're going to see this be around the 400. I think it's going to be between 350 and 450. I don't think it's going to be 500. I could be wrong. 499 seems a little high, considering you can buy OnePlus 7T from last year with a Snapdragon 855 for 499 right now, like from OnePlus. Now, they might stop doing that, but the point is that it's still going to be a better phone without 5G. So I don't know. I think this is exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do. I know it's not coming to North America, but again, with OnePlus, it's like Apple. We're not going to make a stylus and then Apple Pencil.
Well, also the trend. I don't want to call it a trend because it was horrible, but the trend for the last couple of years was really expensive phones. Like we saw iPhone prices get higher and Samsung prices get higher. But this year, a lot of people are talking, like the market awareness is around the iPhone SE and around Google's if they can find the keys to the Pixel 4a, please, get the thing out of the parking lot. But a lot of companies are shipping really good phones at really good price points, and people are talking about them, and you never want to be the company that's not part of that conversation.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, and for me, it's like I don't think I need a flagship. Like, it's nice that OnePlus 8 Pro I have is beautifully fast, and I love it. But I feel like if it was my own money, this is my review unit I'm using. I didn't spend money on it. But if it was my own money right now, I'll be frank with you folks, I would probably look at a mid-range phone for myself. Yeah. I'd be looking at this OnePlus Nord and importing it when it becomes available. I'd be looking at that Oppo Reno 3 Pro 5G. I'd be looking at the next phone we're going to talk about, the Moto Edge Non-Plus, which is going to be $700 in the US, unlocked with a Snapdragon 765G and a detuned camera to, I think, 64 from 108. And that's going to be perfectly fine. Or the LG Velvet, when it finally comes to the US, it's probably going to be cheaper than it is in other markets, because right now it's really expensive for what it is. I think that's still, you're going to say, well, it's only marginally cheaper than like $1,000 phone. Yeah, but $300 is not marginal. $300 buys you like, almost an iPhone SE, right? It's like, you can't dismiss that. So in my ideal world, what I'd love to see is more Snapdragon 765G phones in the 400. I think 400 is a sweet spot that Apple nailed and picked the best possible timing to nail with the iPhone SE. And that's why I'm hoping the OnePlus Nord can just go head to head with the SE. And I want to see more Snapdragon 765G phones in that price, 400 to 550. Here's the thing, right? I don't know if you know this, Rene, but Xiaomi has a sub-brand called Poco that they kind of let loose. They say they let loose, but you know how it
wins
is.
all the MKBHD photo competitions.
And frankly, that's right. The Poco F2 Pro this year is a Snapdragon 865 affordable flagship with 5G that costs $500. So they're already there. The Chinese are already making phones with Qualcomm's fastest chip at $500. So we could see 765 phones from China and India for $350, $300. Now add another $150 for North America and Europe. But because, it's a different market and they want to make more profits, super competitive in India and in China, of course, too. So I get it. So I'm looking forward to the Edge. What's your take generally on the way Motorola is kind of doing this? Because they launched this expensive Verizon exclusive and now they're detuning it. It's very interesting.
I've everything with Motorola, just from Google buying them, Google selling them, and then they made the flip phone, they made the high-end phone, they're making the middle phone. It feels like they're just spinning a lot, and I don't know if they have a long-term strategy. Maybe you think they have a long-term strategy, but I don't see where they're going. I'm glad they're experimenting selfishly because I like seeing cool phones, but as someone who wants all these companies to stay around, I really want them to have long-term strategies to grow their business.
I think with Moto, it's a bit of a special case. The G series is super popular in South and Central America, and so they're just pumping them out, and variants are very, price sensitivity is so high there that the variants make a difference, like a difference in $20 in price between like a Moto G8 Plus versus a G8. It actually makes a difference on paper for people, and I think that's why they're able to do it. I do wish they would, like, as you coming from the Apple universe, it's like, can we please consolidate? But I feel the same way about car manufacturers. Look at BMW. How many variants of the 4 Series Grand Coupe? It's a coupe, but it has 4 doors. No,
I'm not opposed to that. I just want them to make money on every phone so they can keep making the next phone.
Right, yeah. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, I think there are car manufacturers are also in the... Whereas, you go to Tesla and you have like 4 cars to choose from. That's it. You know?
But the car market segments so much compared to the phone market.
It's crazy. So I think I can understand where that's coming from. I don't think it's a good idea. Speaking of super high-end, super expensive phones that I don't think anybody's going to buy with this economy when it comes out, or maybe few people. Well, actually, that's the thing. In the US and in Canada, in part, subsidies through carriers still are a thing. And they're not the subsidies in the traditional model where you pay as part of your plan. It's more like you get like a financing plan that's 0% and whatever purchase
like a
plan.
lease.
And so maybe these phones will somehow settle like that. But there's been leaks of the Note 20 Ultra, which is going to be the best Note you can get.
And of course, it's in gold. or bronze.
It's an interesting, it's a bronze. Nobody really knows, but it's interesting that Samsung leaked their own phone. And
but is it though? I mean, like, I feel like Samsung's web team is never, like, especially the international web teams are never 100% on their closed folder structures. And Apple's done it too, so I can't
See, this is my point. Like, I'm not surprised, but I think this is not marketing planning. This is not a planned leak.
No, I don't think so either. I just
of Samsung incompetence. Like, let's put it the way it is. Like, and what stands out to me, other than a cool cup or whatever finish, is the fact that their periscope folded lens is not. The opening for it isn't square or rectangular like it's been on other phones. They're trying to kind of like.
Make it look like one of the other lenses.
Yeah, which is the first time we've seen that, because there's quite a few. You might not know this if you're an Apple person, but there has been quite a few folded lenses in the market in the last year and a half. So it's interesting. And you touched on this earlier. Qualcomm is launched a new Snapdragon 4100 Wear chip for smartwatches, which typically these chips are used by mostly the Fossil, thank you. The Fossil watch group makes, I think they probably use up 90% of every Snapdragon Wear chip that's ever made. Because they seem to be the only ones making Android Wear watches that are any decent anymore. So this chip was just announced randomly, just literally dropped in my inbox yesterday. So I think what this means is that we're going to start seeing a whole bunch of watches from Fossil in particular with this much improved chip, which, as you pointed out earlier in the show, isn't really that drastically improved. I mean, the 3100 was essentially a Snapdragon 400 from 3 years ago or something. So do you think between that, the Snapdragon 4100 Wear, and Google recently, like last year, acquiring Fitbit, and the other news of the week, that is Google acquired North, the Canadian smart glass manufacturer. Do you think that Google is going to crank the volume on their wearable hardware again in some way? Like, are we going to see a Pixel watch?
So I have like this huge rant about like, I want this stuff so badly. But like when that story came out about Rick Osterloh coming in at the end of the process and going, hey guys, what's with the battery life? I just, like, a part of me died inside. But when you look back, like you need money to make these things. Like, you need gabs of money, and Samsung is not playing with them, and Samsung has gabs of money, and Google is okay about supporting Android given it's such a big, I call it a burden. People got mad at me, but Apple only has to support Apple. Google has to support everybody using Android for everything. It's a big job. And, we've seen how they struggled with tablets, and we've seen how they struggled with wearables. And they're also conflicted against themselves, because some people at Google, like I believe in the C-suite, really want these to be profit-making products. They want revenue, and they want Google to make things, and they want to have a physical, profitable center of products. And other people are like, we just want to use this to dog food our own technology. And can you please put this sensor in because we need to dog food it, or put a notch in this one and put a hole in this one because we need to make sure Android is working well. And then you have a third group who's like, look, these should be cheap devices for developers. What are we doing? We're Google. And none of them talk to each other. And I get so frustrated. So they've bought all these companies, and the products still aren't great. And Google can make great products without buying any of these companies. They're Google. So I think it's more like an executive down to management act of will. They just need to figure out what they want to make it great. And that's all they want from them right now.
Well, like, this is an ongoing theme on this podcast, since we do a lot of Android coverage traditionally. Although I'm sure my audience right now is annoyed with me for doing so much Apple coverage in the last 2 weeks. But look, the reality is, this is the
time. You have to annoy your audience, or you're not doing your job.
There's twice a year where we do this, and I have you on every year for WWDC. Like, this is you should know by now. But the point is, I think that, like, as a former Pixel user that finally switched to OnePlus this year, it's like I could never get on board with a Pixel 4 because, as you know, their Face ID APIs weren't supported by all the apps I use. And there's still, most of my apps still aren't supported. Here we are almost 9 months to 10 months later. And it's just not acceptable to me. I just can't. I can use a password manager. There's the workaround. But considering the phone and what it is, when only the camera is really kick-ass, I need a phone that's kick-ass all around.
Yes.
And Google keeps shooting themselves in the foot with even the basics like a smartphone. if I feel like in the last few years, never mind like a tablet or wearable. I'm not against this Snapdragon 4100. I think it's great. We needed it. Finally, Qualcomm's delivers a chip that's a little more competitive. And I'm glad to see Google acquiring all kinds of stuff. But in the case of North, they already said they're going to stop supporting their glasses, the first generation, and that their second generation product is not coming out. So it reeks to me of Google wants the patents and also didn't North acquire all the patents from the Intel Vault or whatever it was called, Vaunt or whatever. So it's like, I hate the idea that they're absorbing all this stuff and nothing might come out of it, because we all want our smart glasses. And I'm wearing a Samsung watch, which is 2 years old now. And it's been, there's one Samsung watch coming, a new one coming soon. There's been another one last year. And honestly, short of an Apple Watch, which I think is absolutely the pinnacle of a smartwatch today, especially now that it has a display that turns off, that it can stay always on, when you want to. This watch is really so much better than any Android Wear device. Yet and
it also means they're not funding Android Wear.
And exactly. And I was on board the Android Wear, the Wear OS, whatever it's called, bandwagon for many years. But it's just not a viable experience. And so part of me, like Dieter wrote in his newsletter yesterday, wants to believe that we're going to see some hardware. But again, can we please find the keys to the Pixel 4a? Somebody found it. Because anybody found the keys? Because, you're speaking of mid-range phones that I could be happy with.
Yes.
That's all I need. Like, I don't really need, if that would be amazing, because it has a headphone jack. It has a fingerprint sensor in the back, which I really like. And I don't know, it's like Google seems to be, I want to love them. Like, the Pixel Buds are great, but they're just they don't stand out enough.
Yeah. It's just a leadership thing. And we saw that when we talked about Motorola before. Google actually owned Motorola, and I almost forgot that. It's like, stop buying these companies unless you're going to do something with them, and just and I don't care, just make good products.
Yeah, absolutely.
You made Google Glass, and now you're buying North. I get so frustrated.
It's very frustrating. And again, it's also very frustrating that if you like watches and you want a smartwatch, you really can only go to Apple if you're serious. And
well, that's it. Like, if you prefer Samsung or you prefer Apple, you still want Google to be great because it forces Apple and Samsung to be better.
Exactly. And so it's a tough one, because it's like, if you want an Apple Watch, then you need an iPhone. And then if you today, it's with iOS 14, it makes even more sense to have an iPhone, because you can change your default browser and email client and all these other functionality. The discussion we had last week about iOS replicating a lot of Android features. But I'm just feeling like those of us who want that weirdness in the hardware that we get from Android right now, if we want to pair a smartwatch with our Android phone, really, I honestly think the Samsung is really the only way to fly. And if you want a really good band, like fitness band, look no further than Huawei or the entire Huawei group. I've had Huawei bands for exercise for years, and they are absolutely amazing. The sleep track, I sleep with one every night. The sleep tracking is one of the best I have ever used. And I worked in watches. I worked at Pebble for a while. I know a thing or two about smartwatches. I interviewed
you when you were there.
I can tell you that Huawei's automatic sleep algorithm is insanely good. And I'm so glad to see that one of the things came out of WWDC is that the Apple Watch is going to gain sleep tracking. Because to me, that's one of the reasons. I could wear this Samsung watch for sleep tracking. It does it well, but not as well as Huawei. But it's so bulky. Look at it. I want something a little lighter, and that tiny little Huawei band is that thing is so cheap. It's like $79, and it has a GPS in it. I can't believe how commodified hardware has become, And I can't help to think that this, as you said, constant interplay between all these companies is what creates it. But lately, Google is just please make the Pixel 5 a phone that can go head to head with the Galaxy S20, the Galaxy Note 20, the freaking OnePlus 8 and the
Google
OnePlus 9.
Has the best camera algorithms in the world, but they keep throwing commodity glass on those phones. And can you imagine if they just put slightly better glass on those phones, what those cameras would be capable of?
They don't need to go very far. All they need to do is get one of those pixel bin sensors from Sony or something. There are so many good sensors out there. And it doesn't take much effort to do that. Yet they're like, crickets, whatever. Yeah. And I understand that it's still a bit of a jump to support that kind of new architecture, right? But I don't know. Anyway, it's very strange. We live in a really weird universe.
At least we still have coffee. It's not the fringe timeline with no coffee. I'm thankful for that.
Every time, yeah, I'm drinking one right now. Every time I feel like we think Google's gonna somehow not stumble and right themselves in their run, in their jog to make hardware, they fall into a pothole and have to skin their knees again. Yeah. It's just frustrating for those of us who love the ecosystem. But hey,
it's like Apple with services. It's not their primary business, and they're really strappy about it. But you just launch the service, and you're like,
One last bit of news, not super significant, but I want to give a head tip to MediaTek for keeping at it really hard.
Yeah.
They have announced a couple of new gaming-centric chips for what it's worth. The MediaTek Helio G25 and G35. I will link to all the things we discussed, of course, as usual in the show notes, but I'll put a link to an Android Central stories from your previous universe here about...
Still my favorite people.
The details. It's really interesting to me. Like, I always thought gaming phones, I recently reviewed the Red Magic 5G, which is a Snapdragon 865 gaming phone, which is very affordable, $579 for a 5G 865 gaming phone. But gaming phones are a thing, for better or for worse. But it's interesting to me that now we're starting to see tiers within the gaming phone world. Like, originally, like, gaming phones were going to have the best chips. But now we're seeing, chip makers like even Qualcomm with the Snapdragon 720G, for example, or the 730G and 765G, 768G make kind of slightly lower tier gaming chipsets. And with the 25 and 35, we're talking 600 series Snapdragon in terms of performance. So it's interesting to me that they're just basically optimizing the all AI stuff in it for game logic and stuff like that. And it's just interesting to see these chip makers kind of go crazy with that stuff. What's your take in general on the whole gaming phone, gaming chipset thing?
I like it. I just I want more. Like, that's the whole thing is like, I want deep silicon competition. I want everybody to be pushing the boundaries on silicon so that we're not locked into another commodity market for 10 or 20 years. And I think that it's a sign that phones are maturing when they start to segment. And we've really been resistant to that. We've been using these very mainstream general purpose phones. So if we start getting phones that are, and we've seen a few of them now, phones that are more centered on gaming, that's great. Give us phones that are centered on, I never understood, Miriam, and I don't want to get off a tangent because we're near the end of the show, but I never understood why Microsoft didn't drop an Xbox phone on the shelf next to an iPhone, next to an Office phone, like if they had to, but just brand it Xbox, have Halo on it day one, go back 7 years and do that, because the branding was there, the time was there, the technology was there.
Yeah, it would have been the equivalent of today's Nintendo, right?
Yeah.
The Switch. It would be the Switch Lite, but back then, basically.
Yeah.
Well, Sony tried to do that, remember, with the PlayStation. I don't know what it was called.
They kinda, and they didn't have they didn't have a lot of the things in place.
Xperia Play. That's what it was. Yeah. Well, you're right. This you and I need to make a podcast about alternate universes one day. All the possible branches. Well, there are many, but pick a few that we cover on the show.
The one when WebOS is the dominant phone in the market.
If you want to have that show and on your YouTube, I'll be happy to jump into it. Rene, do you want to tell people where on the internet they can find you, all the different social handles and all that stuff?
Sure. So I make it really easy. I'm Rene Ritchie, ReneRitchie on everything. So YouTube /Rene Ritchie, Instagram, Twitter /Rene Ritchie, all of that good stuff. So YouTube is where I spend most of my time right now.
Yes, please go to Rene's YouTube channel and subscribe now. There's also a Patreon there if you want to support him.
Thank you.
Really great analysis on everything, but a lot of it, obviously, with a lot of expertise in the world of Apple. But check it out. This is... it's been a treat to watch your videos, Rene.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and folks, you know where to find me on the internet. I'm at Tankgirl, that's TNKGRL. Like the comic book characters, just drop the vowels on Twitter and Instagram. So Twitter is where you should go to discuss this podcast with me. It's really hard to comment on podcasts. There's really no simplified way of doing that. So hit me up on Twitter if you have questions, comments or corrections or whatever. And then on Instagram, I have pretty pictures of phones and pretty pictures taken with phones. I'm currently reviewing Sony's Xperia 1 Mark II, which is their high-end camera-centric smartphone. And it's pretty interesting. And so stay tuned for a review on hot hardware for that. Then, of course, there's a YouTube channel, youtube.com/mobiletech podcast. If you want to see some visual content that goes along with this podcast, something to sink your eyes into rather than your ears, this is the place to go. I've got a bunch of unboxings and stuff like that, so check that out. I want to remind you that if you just dropped in and you're like, hey, I know Rene and I'm listening to this podcast, the podcast lives at mobiletechpodcast.com. And of course, please subscribe. There's an RSS feed there that's old school, but if you want something easier, just go to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, or Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcast universe lives, and type in Mobile Tech Podcast with Tankgirl, TNKGRL, and you'll find the show, and you can subscribe. I hope you do. Subscribe to the YouTube, subscribe to the podcast, and all that good stuff. Also, I wanted to say that while I don't have a Patreon, and I would like to say yet, I'm working on that maybe.
Awesome.
I'm trying to decide how I want to do that. In the meantime, there's a donate button in the link in the show notes below. Please consider donating. It's a PayPal link that would really help me and the show and making it happen every week. And finally, I want to thank our sponsor, Audible. Audible has been with us since the early days of the show, over 2 years now, and they're a pretty amazing sponsor because they are the best audiobook platform you can get out there. I mean, look, if you read books and you love books, and maybe at some point you can't physically read one because you're maybe a delivery driver dropping off that FedEx phone review that I'm going to review next, you need a way to listen to audiobooks. You can't do podcasts all day. So Audible's got you covered. And if you want a deal and support the show, we've got a special thing going on. So 30-day free trial, you get to keep a book at the end. You can stay or leave, whatever you want. But if you do click through that link that is in the show notes that I will be giving you in a second, you support the podcast, you support Audible, our sponsor, and you might open up Pandora's box in the sense that they have an incredible selection. You will love the stuff there. A lot of the books are read by the authors. I just really, really love browsing around, downloading a book, listening to it on a road trip. And yes, a lot of us are staying home right now, but maybe that's a good way for you to just tune out the noise and take a break with your headphones on in your office. Check it out. And if you're definitely one of those hardworking folks out there with your true wireless earbuds in all day, you might want to check out Audible. So the link is audibletrial.com/mobiletech. That's audibletrial.com/mobiletech. Check it out. It's also in the show notes below. And please consider supporting me and supporting Audible by clicking through. So thanks to Audible again. And Rene, thanks for being on the show yet again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's always a delight. I love talking to you.
Wonderful. I enjoy it as well. And we will have you on again, maybe even before WWDC. Maybe I can corner you down on the week of iPhone launch. I know that's always a hard week for you, but we'll try. Anyway, folks, stay tuned. We'll have another show next week. And until then, cheers, everybody.
This has been the Mobile Tech Podcast with Tankgirl, proudly presented by worldpodcasts.com. You can visit us online at mobiletechpodcast.com.